In today's episode of the Neil Wilkins podcast, I'm joined by Tim Olsen. Tim is an AI risk expert, and we're going to do a deep dive into all things AI risk as we go through this conversation. This is something I think that is going to really resonate if you are looking to dip your toes in the water of all things AI. I'm sure ChatGPT is on everybody's radar right now, but there are many other opportunities and options within this broader kind of conversation, and that's where we're going to go in this particular episode of the podcast. So welcome, Tim.
Hi, Neil. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So for the audience's benefit, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know Tim Olsen, do you want to give a little bit of background? Because I'm curious as to how did you end up in AI? I mean, obviously, this is a big trending topic right now, but I'm sure there must have been a little bit of a journey that was choreographed in this direction to arrive where you are right now today. So what is the backstory?
Yeah. Okay. It is quite a journey, actually. Believe it or not, I started my career selling tickets on street corners, then moved to selling mobile phones, and then moved into project managing technical deliveries for those stores. And really, as my career developed, it was all about improving user journeys and automation. And more recently, I joined Capita, where I helped deliver their robotic process automation department, which ended up being the largest in the UK. And I then went on to work on other forms of automation consulting. And I now work for a consulting company called Emposo, where I'm consulting director for intelligent automation, but also other emerging technologies, which of course includes AI. And my relationship as well with Hayes Recruitment means that I have quite a strong interest in the future of work and how AI is likely to impact people in the future in their employment. So it all ties up quite neatly, really.
Yeah, and that was the first kind of time I guess I'd sort of listened to you talk, because it was at a Hayes event where I first heard you being interviewed, and yeah, some of the wisdom that was coming through, I thought, I've got to get Tim on my podcast, because this is something that is going around and around in the circles of marketers right now, and I guess across all forms of business in all sort of areas, from, as you've described there, sort of HR and sort of people development, all the way through to the kind of the sharp end, I guess, of the commercial sort of value that things like AI and automation can bring. So to me, it was an absolutely obvious request to see if I could get you onto the show. So thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to bear here in this space. And I think from a marketer's perspective, I mean, this is obviously going to be the predominance of the audience. There will be people obviously listening to this who aren't marketers and maybe entrepreneurs, business owners. So we'll keep this kind of quite broad, but I know from speaking to a lot of marketers right now, they are concerned, I think, to try and embrace this new thing. We'll just call it generically AI, but just this emerging world of technical challenge, because I think for a lot of marketers growing up in the world of the internet and social media, etc., that is all they've known. They haven't known this world. They're not probably as mature as you and I, Tim, if I put it that way. So kind of we remember the world before that. But I think a lot of marketers kind of playing today are kind of in this space of, got this new emerging kind of opportunity. But I'm a little bit concerned. I'm a little bit scared. There's kind of unknowns in there. So I'm viewing it with trepidation. So I think that's going to be the spin of this particular conversation. I mean, from my perspective, I think it would be a really good starting point to see if we can kind of almost define what we're talking about here. So, I mean, could you kind of first explain from your perspective, really, what AI risk means, so that we can really understand the concept that we're discussing?
Yeah, sure. So let me sort of start at the beginning, really. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what AI is and how you define it. And that's actually a lot more difficult than you might think. But primarily, the definition of AI is an application that has human-like intelligence, that it has the ability to think rationally. There was a guy called Larry Tesler, who I often quote. He actually passed away last week, I believe. But he had a theorem which basically said AI is whatever is too difficult to do at the moment. And whilst that's quite a simplistic view, there's a lot of truth in it, actually, because if you look back at what we've defined as AI in the past, we keep moving the goalposts. So what we would have called AI 5 years ago, if you think about a very, very simple chatbot, today that's no longer considered to be AI. In the 1960s, we had Eliza, which was probably the first chatbot, which at the time was considered to be AI. But now we just wouldn't say that. So the goalposts do keep moving. But of course, what has happened recently is we've seen generative AI come to the fore. Since around September last year, it's just gone absolutely nuts, really. And generative AI uses neural networks and machine learning. So I don't think anybody could argue that this is definitely true AI, if you like. And it uses those frameworks to understand language primarily, but also potentially the way the world operates as well. In theory, when we talk about generative AI such as ChatGPT, we're really talking about a fancy form of predictive text, just like on your phone, right? What it does is it looks for the next word in a sentence and then the next word after that. And it just creates the text in that format. But there's a lot more to it than that. When we talk about risk, if I give you one example, the real problem with generative AI and neural networks is that even the suppliers of these systems don't really understand what the neural networks are really doing. And we're starting to see some emergent behaviors which are quite difficult to put down to simple predictive text. So, for example, ChatGPT has learned Persian, but it's not in any of the training data. And similarly, with some of the good large language models, you can ask it to take a floor tile, a bottle, and a tennis ball, and to stack it in the most robust way. And some of them will be able to do that, and some of them won't. But that demands some knowledge about the world and the shape of these items and how they all interact. So for those that are successful in doing that, because it's highly unlikely anybody's asked them this question before, you have to wonder, well, how has it come to that conclusion? So the system does seem to be learning very quickly and autonomously as well. And of course, that has risks in itself. So it's really important that we control and regulate the development of AI as it improves. Indeed, even some of the most senior people in AI, such as Geoffrey Hinton, who's sometimes called the godfather of AI, he worked for Google. He identified 6 primary risks for AI, and they were bias, so amplifying the existing bias in data, malicious misinformation such as deepfakes, echo chambers, whereby AI can lead people into echo chambers in social media and exaggerate and polarize opinion, jobs and inequality. Potentially AI could take away jobs and leave people unemployed. AI in warfare, which is a significant concern. And of course, the singularity, whereby AI becomes more intelligent than humans and has potential to take over. So they're the risks that Geoffrey Hinton stipulates. But I think there are some more than that as well. I think there are risks around manipulation by AI being able to use highly personalized targeted data, digital immersion, by which, most of us now are addicted to our phones. But the way AI is going, it can become more personalized, and that immersion can become extreme. And finally, cybercrime as well. AI has the ability to create new viruses and impact us in ways that we've never seen before.
So those are some very, very interesting ideas and considerations on that list, Tim. I mean, really, wow! It's almost like a wake-up call for all of us to be thinking, there is risk associated with all of these opportunities, and it's almost like we have to, decide and prioritize which are the most significant, but also which are the lighter touch, and then we can then just, forge forward. So could we do a little bit of if you're okay with this, a bit of a deeper dive into some of these ideas, because I think people will get a lot of value from understanding a little bit more behind the thinking as to why these are the key ones right now.
Yeah, sure. So let's start off with the risk around job loss and economic disruption, if we can. So obviously the theory here is that AI could take over people's jobs and leave them unemployed. If we go back 2-3 years ago, if you were to ask me then, what would be the impact of automation and AI, I probably would have said it would primarily be blue collar workers who are doing repetitive tasks. And of course, with robotics, I think it's probably still safe to say that. But with the advent of generative AI, actually, we're now finding that it's impacting white collar workers, and it's able to do creative tasks as well. So it's inevitably having an impact on employment. World Economic Forum actually did a study on this recently, and they looked at which jobs were likely to fall by the wayside, such as administrative jobs, legal, some marketing impacts potentially, customer care, developers. In fact, there's a bank currently, and 48% of its development or coding is currently completed by generative AI models. But there would be new roles created as well, such as machine learning engineers, data analysts, and some non-technical roles as well, such as ethicists, trainers, communications, etc. And on the whole, they found that over the next 5 years, there would actually be a net increase in employment as a result of AI. And of course, when we talk about AI, there are other roles that go around that as well, such as cyber, infrastructure, cloud, virtual reality, and other forms of robotics. And, they all could be positively impacted as well. I have to say, I'm less convinced about prompt engineers. I know there's a lot of hype about that in the media at the moment, but I suspect that's a bit of a passing fad. I don't see that as being a long-term role as a result of AI. But there are other impacts as well. So, for example, AI might potentially lower the bar to enter new careers. So I'm not necessarily suggesting we do this, but for example, medical diagnostics. It may be that by using systems like GPT in the future, it's easier for doctors to get into that profession and operate with less training. Again, the whole thing about developers and coding, junior coding roles can be completed potentially by generative AI. So there is an argument to say, well, actually, it's easier to get into these roles. But in the medium time, if the issue isn't the number of jobs, it's primarily the transition of skills from one to another. So for those people who are displaced, how do you upskill those for the roles that are being created? And that's a real problem for us. One good example of that is IKEA. So they recently introduced a chatbot called Billy, same as their shelves. And they retrained 8,500 customer service agents and turned them into interior designers. So that's a fantastic example of ethical automation, rather than making a large proportion of their workforce redundant, they've gone and retrained them. But I think looking further ahead is much more difficult. I know PwC have done a study that suggests that by the mid-2030s, up to 30% of UK jobs could be at risk of automation. So this is a real problem. We don't really know what's going to happen, but there could be significant socio-economic impacts, and we may need to look at how we restructure things like basic income, for example, and whether potentially we tax robots and automation in the future. I don't know. But looking at some of the other risks that we discussed, there's the risk about algorithmic bias. So AI systems learn patterns from data, and of course, the data that they learn from might have inherent biases within them. And we know, for example, that there have been problems with facial recognition for people of color. And hiring tools have sometimes showed a bias towards screening against females. And similarly, credit score models have sometimes resulted in less favorable outcomes for minority groups. So the impact of bias can be very significant, and it has an impact on people's lives, liberties, and their economic opportunities. We spoke a little bit about autonomous weapons. I think there is a very real risk that we will enter a bit of a race against other countries to develop autonomous weapons. We're seeing a proliferation of drones. And one of the problems with this is that, if you're able to attack another country with no loss of life to your side, then it makes you more willing potentially to enter into a war. So there are real ethical issues around that as well. I mentioned cybersecurity. AI is being used to create new viruses, and there's a race to create AI to protect against those viruses. But if that becomes imbalanced, then we're going to have significant problems. Similarly, it's also possible to poison training data. So, for example, if an AI system uses thousands of pictures of cats to identify a cat, but you place one white pixel in the upper right corner of every one of those pictures, and then you do the same for a picture of a dog, it will think that picture of a dog is a cat because it recognizes that pixel as being important in the definition of a cat. So, we have to be really, really careful about how poison data can be used to train AI in many different ways. I talked a little bit about the existential threat from AI. It's really difficult to make a judgment on that. Most experts think the risk of a singularity is around 5%, which is quite significant, actually. So that's a real concern. It shows that there's a need for human oversight and global regulation. I said that there were some other risks as well that I feel are quite important to add to that list. So one is around manipulation, and I think from a marketing perspective, this is actually really key. I think if AI has access to personal data, it means that machine learning could become extremely effective at knowing which buttons to press for individuals. We all know that Amazon is getting incredibly good at suggesting what products you should buy. But I think, AI having access to that level of data could make it incredibly accurate and quite manipulative. And that's something else that we need to be aware of. I talked as well about digital immersion. And what I mean by that is we're starting to see chatbots come through that are almost imperceptible from humans. And similarly, these can also have access to all your data in the future. So we know Siri is going to be replaced, for example. And I think that people will become not only very addicted to these technologies, but potentially even build emotional relationships with them. Um, and when we look at virtual reality coming, we talk about the metaverse. People will be immersed in these digital worlds, and potentially might be quite difficult to get out of that. So again, I'm not quite sure um, how we deal with that, but it's something that we need to be aware of.
I think one of those that's yeah, it's really, really interesting to hear that kind of holistically. One of the things that is coming through to me loud and clear, and I don't know what obviously everyone else is picking up listening to this, but one of the things that clearly is coming through to me here is this, I guess in coming through in all of the examples that you've given there, is this idea of trying to avoid bias. It feels like there's a real ethical responsibility on not just marketers, but everybody encountering any form of AI to be, as far as you can, ethically, transparently, and honestly trying to do your best not to bias. I mean, there's a whole human psychology around the concept of bias, which is so inherent in the way that we operate as human beings that it's going to be a tough one to crack. But I think if there's an intention there, it feels like bias has got to be right at the top of the list, really, because within marketing, obviously, we've got consequences like at the moment coming through, where if you look at sort of advertising, for example, balancing a diverse range of sort of ethnicities, of demographics, of genders, to ensure that you are balanced appropriately for the product or service that you're giving. I mean, do you sort of see that coming through as well? I mean, from your side of things in the world that you're sort of operating in, do you think that kind of bias as a broader concept is going to be very significant to be thinking about, and then mitigating any risks against that?
Absolutely. I think it's probably one of the prime risks that we have currently, certainly within businesses. From a recruitment perspective, for example, I would suggest never using AI. Certainly at the moment, never using AI for any selection criteria or activities. You should steer well clear of that where there is any potential for bias. Because the bias is always inherent in the data, okay, and it's very difficult to avoid that. I think from a marketing perspective, you have to be aware there are a number of areas where bias comes to play. I think the first is you can have biased targeting. So, for example, an algorithm that's trained on data predominantly from, should we say, a white population may not effectively target a fully diverse audience. So, not from a marketing perspective, but we've actually seen this elsewhere with medical scans, whereby an organisation has used scans for detecting cancer or whatever in the northern hemisphere, and then found that certain people don't fit that mold, and it's less effective on them, and that's because the training data has all been from the northern hemisphere. So when you're not looking at a fully representative set of training data, then you won't get the right results out of it. So that's really important. Going back to the impact on marketing again, you've got pricing bias as well. So if there's an algorithm that could offer discounts to certain groups of users based on demographic data, that has potential to result in unfair pricing for other groups. And this is, the consequences of this sort of bias can be really significant. It can result in a loss of trust from consumers who may feel that they're being unfairly treated. It has very significant legal issues. It can result in, violations of anti-discrimination laws, for example. And of course, it can result in missed opportunities. If you're failing to reach that wider audience or generate more revenue, then you miss out on that opportunity. So, well, how can you try and mitigate against this? Well, you can ensure that you're using diverse and representative data sets in order to train the AI algorithms. But you also need to regularly audit those as well to make sure that they're operating in the way that they should be, and to try to identify and address any potential biases. But yeah, overall, it's just important for marketers to be very proactive in addressing AI bias and ensuring that their marketing efforts are both ethical and effective.
So this is going to really take, I think, targeting and personalization, which you talk about there, I think probably to the next level. I mean, I think, obviously inherent in good, accurate, positive, proactive marketing is the whole concept of personalization and customization. I think, there's going to be a lot of tussling, I think, for many marketers trying to tick all the boxes that you've mentioned there with just this whole inherent idea of, if I can do one-to-one targeting of an individual using AI or not, if there's a more traditional means, then what I need to be doing is almost very, very pure marketing. So it is actually treating every single individual I encounter almost as a unique entity. This is going to get expensive. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here about how this might play out, because to be able to do all of those things in terms of like reducing bias and, just really being very, very authentic, and the privacy concerns. And as you've described there, just, building trust amongst your customer base. There are so many things to consider here. I mean, it feels like the next step for anybody doing this would be to take a big deep breath, realize that Tim has just shaken the whole marketing box here and sort of said, guys, you've got to wake up to this, because this is not a case of just jumping in and doing stuff. I mean, is the first kind of point of getting a grasp on all of this, doing a risk assessment? It feels like this is kind of where the conversation is leading here, that before kind of trying to roll out any kind of AI solution, be it through your business strategy or trying to integrate it into an existing marketing strategy, you have to really do a risk assessment on where you are right now, because otherwise all you're going to be doing, probably, it sounds like, is just adding to the confusion, adding to the problems going forward. So, I mean, do you have sort of practical tips on how somebody listening to this thinking, crikey, I really need to get a grasp of this, how would they begin to conduct some form of risk assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. So risk assessment is a key element. I think there are other things that we need to look at as well. And so probably the first thing to do is to establish a very clear AI governance framework. And that outlines the policies and procedures and guidance that your organization needs to follow for anybody using AI within that organization. And I think we need to ensure as well that we're using explainable AI techniques so that we understand how the AI is making those decisions, and we monitor that for biases and issues as well. And also that everybody in the organization is trained on AI. So not only so they know how it works and what it's doing, but also for their own benefit, that nobody is left behind. But you're absolutely right as well that risk assessments is part of how we manage the risk within a business. And yeah, I can try and give you some tips on that. So I think the areas that you would need to look at are really around privacy, the privacy of data, the security both of that data and the broader system. And of course, we've spoken about bias as well. And also understanding whether there are any unintended consequences that might come out of the use of AI, and how that could impact both your business and customers as well. We need to, in order to do all those things, one of the things we need to do is to evaluate the data that is used to both train and validate the AI solution. And in order to do that, we need to assess the accuracy of the data to make sure it's valid, the completeness, and also the representativeness of the data. Because if we're only training it with a small sample, like I said before, we might be missing out on, quite significant sectors who may be there in reality. So we need to ensure that the data covers all areas and is representative of everything within it. And then once we've done that, we can try to identify any potential biases in the data that might be able to impact the performance of the AI solution. And I think finally, once you've got all that information, you can then try to develop a risk management plan that outlines strategies to mitigate any of those risks, really.
So is what you're saying here then really that to be able to do that, really, I mean, it feels like it's quite important that, anybody attending to this, so marketers, but anybody else who is kind of in this meeting or this assessment or this planning session, to really have almost, I guess we could call it, sort of foundational understanding of how AI works, because it feels like to be able to use it responsibly, to be able to manage potential risks, you kind of need to be able to even think about the biases, to think about the privacy, to think about the kind of how you're going to train it. I think that was a really key point you just mentioned there. It's almost like you have to kind of have a base understanding of how these things work, because otherwise you could be making some sort of wide sweeping assumptions that, oh, it can do this, it can do that. And actually it might take you very, very kind of off-piste, as it were. So how much do you think people should really understand how the AI actually works to be able to do this in effect?
I think people need to have a foundational understanding of it. If you're using, for example, Chat GPT, you need to understand its limitations. So it's really important to appreciate, for example, that it can hallucinate. Yeah, there's an example of a lawyer recently who used GPT to create I think it was a defense, and it was referring very confidently to a particular case, and it turned out that case just didn't exist in reality. So I've heard it even said that, if you're going to use GPT, you kind of have to know what the answer is before you ask the question in order to validate it. And there is some truth in that. So you must know the limitations. And I think if we're talking about, building your own AI system, then it's particularly important that you are able to identify the potential risks that are associated with it, such as bias, privacy, security, etc. And if you're implementing a system, you need to be able to evaluate the different AI solutions, because there are multiple different models of AI, and you need to be able to determine which ones are most appropriate for the business and the outputs that you need from it. But in addition to that, you need to have the broader understanding of the ethical consequences and the practices that you need to employ to prioritize fairness and transparency and accountability. And in order to do that, you need to understand, how to make the data representative and avoid bias, etc. And I think, speaking more broadly, if you're dealing with AI, you have to be accountable for being able to communicate that to stakeholders, both internal employees, but also your customers and clients. And you need to be able to explain how you use AI and what the potential benefits and risks are, or people will lose confidence in the solution. What I will say is there's some really good training at the moment, free training, on both LinkedIn and Google. So if you look up AI training and foundation training for generative AI, then there's some really good courses available now, and that would be a good starting point.
Great start. And I love that point that you make about using AI at the moment for validation, not necessarily creation. I love that. So it's kind of making the assumption that you already know the answer, Oh, that's a very nice positioning, because it feels that, with this conversation being about risk within AI, that is just a lovely starting point. There's a level of expectation, I think, by pushing the boundaries too far, too quickly, too soon, that are actually kind of reined in a little bit by that, sort of not necessarily think AI is your, answer to everything, but actually AI is going to be your validator, or it could be your first draft creator, or it could be something that's just going to give you maybe an alternative to the way that you've done things, an alternative to consider, not the end answer. Do you think that's fair to say?
Absolutely. I think the way I would tend to describe the way you should use generative AI is treat it like an unreliable intern, okay? Because it can go away and it can do legwork for you, but you would always want to see that work when it comes back and validate it. So I think that's a really good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I can certainly speak from personal experience there. That's what it feels like. You start chatting with it, and it feels like at the start of the day, it's going to go off and do some things whilst you're doing other things. But you're going to have to check the work when it comes in, because, yeah, it's still got to sound like you. It's still got to have the right tone of voice and style. And you can teach it, and you can talk to it, and you can chat with it. That's the point. But yeah, it's a validation process right now. I mean, I'm guessing, and I'm sure you'd be of the similar mind, that we are still very much at the starting gate of what AI will be in the future. I mean, it feels like we're scratching at a very, very interesting surface of possibilities into the future. I mean, what kind of things are you seeing emerging right now? Are there any sort of particular developments that have got your attention? And do they have different risks associated with them?
Yeah, definitely. I think whilst many people would argue that actually generative AI has been around for quite some time, before GPT came to the fore last year. But we are really seeing stuff start to take off that is empowered by these large language models. Now, I have a bit of a background in speech technologies, actually. And if you look at some of the applications that are coming through, so there's one that I use called Pi, and I strongly suggest that you take a look at that, because the quality of the conversation on that application is just absolutely phenomenal. And once you start to link that conversational capability with back-end data and back-end systems, and if you think about, for example, Siri on your phone, if you've got that conversational quality, but it can link itself usefully to the other applications in your phone, it becomes immensely powerful. If you might want to look up Google Duplex, which was an application Google were working on, which could actually make a call on your behalf, a telephone call, to do something like arranging an appointment. And the person on the other end of the phone would have no idea that they were speaking to a robot. And where I'm getting to with this is you will have very, very powerful virtual assistants, but also when you look at that in an enterprise context, I think call centers, I don't think we're far off automating probably 80% of call centers with these sorts of virtual assistants. I can see that happening probably in the next 5 to 7 years. So there are certain sectors that will really be impacted very significantly. And, as I say, at the moment, most of us are just using this technology ad hoc, but we will see this technology built into enterprise systems very shortly. So, for example, Microsoft is building Copilot, which uses large language models. It links it to the data in the back end. And my understanding of Copilot will be that, you will be able to say to your laptop, I had a meeting last Thursday with X company, create me a sales presentation based on that conversation. And it will have the ability to create that presentation. So Copilot will be a huge step forward as well. So yeah, I think we're going to see generative AI really powering or empowering a technical revolution in many areas, and it's actually quite difficult to imagine all of the outcomes of that. But it's an exciting time to be alive, Neil. Yeah.
I was going to sort of say, how do you feel about the future? Because, looking at risk, I guess there is always this my position that yes, I have to almost protect my clients, my customers, and I need to protect the world from impending doom and dangers that all this stuff sort of potentially presents. I mean, do you still feel they're really positive? I mean, just thinking as a closing thought, how do you see the future kind of playing out? I'm not necessarily thinking we have to see Tim's crystal ball here to sort of be held against you if you get it wrong, but I mean, do you see that this is a positive landscape? I think, again, for marketers, for businesses, looking to forge, deeper customer relationships, for example. Do you think there are certain areas where, in a positive way, they can prepare themselves and navigate the landscape successfully?
Yeah, I think the honest answer to that is I'm conflicted. I think on one hand, AI has the potential to revolutionize the way that businesses operate and interact with customers. From a marketing perspective, you can have highly personalized marketing. You can automate many of the boring tasks involved in marketing. I've heard somebody compare thinking to funking, whereby thinking is the lower level order of thought, and if you can automate thinking but leave thinking to humans, if that makes sense, I think that's the way forward there. And of course, AI can create really intelligent predictive analytics as well, to predict customer behavior and which products they're likely to buy. So from a marketing perspective, there's lots of benefits to AI, and it's definitely going to revolutionize the industry. But on the other hand as well, we've talked about some of the risks associated with it, the risks to privacy and security and bias. And I think the risk that I added was around, manipulation, and that really does worry me. So I think it's important that we all take accountability for AI. I think we need to ensure that we have human oversight on everything that it does, and I think we collectively need to ensure that whatever it does is for the overall benefit of humanity. We all have that accountability, and I think if there was one thing I wanted people to take away, it was to consider that as they deploy AI.
And I guess, that's, and I'd say, very well said, because I guess that comes down to an individual level, doesn't it? It is inherent to all of us that we, really embrace that and say, look, no matter what role we play at work, or, kind of what our aspirations are for the future, this is something that stops with us as individuals, because unless we do the teaching of the systems properly, unless, as you say, we've got good intentions, this thing could get very, very sticky very, very quickly. So yeah, I think that's a really nice kind of parting sort of piece for people to really consider. This has been so interesting, Tim, and thank you so much for all those little anecdotes and kind of places for us to go as well. I'm going to put some links. I've been making notes actually as you've been talking, so I'm going to put links to the various examples that you've given in the description below for everybody to follow up and have a little look at. And one that I do want to include, actually, because I believe the Emposo website has just been rebranded. I think there's some new stuff going on. So do you want to give a bit of a shout out to direct people in your direction should they wish to follow up?
Yeah, sure. If you just go to www.emposo.com, that will get you to our website, and you can see the various different areas that we specialize in there. But if anybody would like to speak to me about artificial intelligence, then by all means, just drop me a line.
Brilliant. And I'll include all those details as well in the description below. And just a little quick shameless plug out for a AI and metaverse marketing workshop that I'm beginning on the 4th of October of this year, which will be deeper dives into what all this stuff means for marketers and more. And we're actually going to run this within the metaverse, and I will include a link to that, first of a monthly series of short courses virtually held within the metaverse, because of course we can, so we should. And I will welcome any inquiries and any further details that anybody requires if they are interested in that. So see the details below this particular broadcast. So thank you again, Tim, for your time and wisdom on the episode today. Really found this fascinating, and I've got a few examples of things I'm going to go and have a look at now myself. So thanks again.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.